History loves talking about European medieval kings and their castles, but what about the African emperor who controlled more gold than all of Europe combined? What about the ruler whose kingdom was so wealthy that, when his successor went on pilgrimage, he crashed the entire Mediterranean economy just by giving away gifts? This is the story of Sundiata Keita, a man who couldn't walk for the first decade of his life but became the most feared warrior in West Africa. A prince cast out by his own family who built an empire spanning 500,000 square miles. A leader who united dozens of warring tribes under a single banner and created the world's first constitution, centuries before the Magna Carta. But here's the mind-blowing part. European maps from the 1300s literally placed his empire at the center of the world, calling it the richest kingdom on earth. Yet, today, most people have never heard his name. So, how does a disabled boy, abandoned by his father's court and hunted by his own half-brother, transform into the Lion King of Africa? How does someone with nothing build a civilization that controlled the world's gold supply for 3 centuries? This isn't just a story about one man's rise to power. This is about the birth of democracy, the art of war, and the deadly price of absolute authority. Because every empire that rises must eventually face a reckoning, and Sundiata's choices would echo through generations, shaping the destiny of an entire continent. Picture West Africa in the year 1200. This isn't the Africa that colonial textbooks described. This is a land of sophisticated kingdoms, international trade routes, and cities that rival Paris and London. Gold flows like rivers from the Bambouk mines. Salt caravans stretch across the Sahara like ancient highways. Islamic scholars debate philosophy in Timbuktu's universities, while traditional griots preserve oral histories spanning centuries. But this world is fracturing. The once mighty Ghana Empire is crumbling. Warlords fight over trade routes. The Soso king Sumanguru has emerged as a brutal tyrant, crushing any opposition with supernatural terror and military might. Tribes that once prospered now live in fear, their young men enslaved, their wealth stolen. Into this chaos, a legend is about to be born. But first, that legend must learn to walk. In the small kingdom of Niani, a prophecy haunts the royal court. 2 mysterious hunters have arrived with a strange woman, a woman so ugly that no man wants her, but whose sons, the spirits say, will rule an empire greater than any before it. King Nare Magan must choose: marry this woman as the prophecy demands, or ignore the warnings of fate itself. He chooses prophecy over pride. That decision will unleash forces that reshape an entire continent, because the son born from this union won't just inherit a throne. He'll have to fight every step of the way to claim it, and his first battle won't be against enemies or rival kingdoms. His first battle will be against his own body, which refuses to let him stand. The year is 1217, and in the royal compound of Niani, a child struggles with something that should be natural as breathing, taking his first steps. Sundiata Keita is nearly 10 years old, but his legs remain weak, his body seemingly cursed by the very spirits that prophesied his greatness. Imagine the humiliation. You're the son of a king, but you crawl while other children run. Your half-brother Dankaran Tuman walks tall and proud, already wielding a sword while you can barely hold yourself upright. The court whispers that perhaps the prophecy was wrong. Perhaps the spirits chose the wrong child. Sundiata's mother, Sogolon, becomes his shield against the cruel laughter of the court. She's no beauty. The griots describe her as having a hunched back and bulging eyes, but her love burns fierce as forge fire. Every night she massages her son's legs, whispering ancient Mandinka prayers, telling him stories of great hunters and legendary kings. But love alone can't strengthen bones or straighten spines. When King Nare Magan dies, the succession is swift and brutal. Dankaran Tuman claims the throne, and his first act is to strip Sundiata's family of all privileges. They're cast out from the royal quarters, forced to live like commoners. Sundiata watches, still unable to stand, as his half-brother distributes his father's wealth to loyal supporters. The message is clear: stay down, stay quiet, stay forgotten. For 3 years, this becomes Sundiata's reality. He learns to navigate the world from ground level, developing an intimate understanding of how power really works. He sees which guards can be bribed, which courtiers shift loyalties based on profit, which alliances hold firm and which crumble at the first sign of pressure. His disability becomes his education in the brutal mathematics of political survival. Meanwhile, across the region, the Soso king Sumanguru is expanding his reign of terror. And this isn't just military conquest. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. Sumanguru claims supernatural powers, decorating his palace with the heads of defeated kings, wearing their skin as trophies. He outlaws traditional customs, destroys sacred sites, and deliberately humiliates conquered peoples by forcing them to abandon their ancestors' ways. Village after village falls. Some resist and are burned to ash. Others submit and watch their children dragged away as slaves. The psychological impact is devastating. If mighty kingdoms can't stand against Sumanguru, what hope do scattered tribes have? But then, something miraculous happens in Niani. Sundiata is now 13, and his mother can no longer bear watching him crawl. In desperation, she approaches the royal blacksmith and begs him to forge an iron staff, not for walking, but for strength training. The blacksmith, moved by her determination, creates something extraordinary, a staff so heavy that grown men struggle to lift it. Sogolon presents it to her son with tears in her eyes. "Today," she says, "you choose who you will become." Picture this moment. You are Sundiata, facing the defining challenge of your young life. This staff weighs more than your entire body. Your legs have never supported your full weight. Everyone expects you to fail. Again, your half-brother's supporters have gathered to watch, anticipating another humiliation to solidify Dankaran Tuman's position. But something is different this time. Maybe it's the accumulated rage of years of mockery. Maybe it's the weight of prophecy pressing down like destiny itself. Or maybe it's simply that some battles can only be won when the cost of losing becomes unbearable. Sundiata grips the iron staff with both hands. His arms shake with effort. His leg muscles, weak from disuse, scream in protest. But slowly, impossibly, he begins to rise. The court falls silent. Even his enemies hold their breath. Inch by inch, Sundiata pulls himself upright. When he finally stands, truly stands, for the first time in his life, something magical happens. The heavy iron staff bends under the pressure of his grip, curving like a bow. He doesn't just learn to walk that day. Word spreads through the kingdom like wildfire. The crippled prince has found his strength. But more than that, he's demonstrated something that terrifies his enemies. An unbreakable will that can bend iron itself. Dankaran Tuman realizes his mistake immediately. By allowing his half-brother to live, he's created a rival whose very existence undermines his legitimacy. If the prophecy is true, if Sundiata really is destined for greatness, then every day he remains alive is another day for that prophecy to fulfill itself. The assassination attempts begin within weeks. The first is subtle. Poisoned food left where Sundiata trains. But Sogolon, wise in the ways of court intrigue, has taught her son to trust no one's cooking but hers. The second attempt is more direct, hired assassins creeping through his quarters at night. But Sundiata's years of watching from ground level have made him hypersensitive to movement and sound. He hears them coming. By the third attempt, it's clear that staying in Niani means death. Sogolon makes the hardest decision of her life. They must flee, not just the palace, but the kingdom itself. Better to live in exile with hope than die at home with honor. She packs only essentials, some gold, her son's iron staff, and the sacred objects that prove his royal lineage. Under cover of darkness, they slip away from the only home Sundiata has ever known. But here's what Dankaran Tuman doesn't understand. By forcing his brother into exile, he's just unleashed him upon the world. A boy who learned to walk through sheer willpower isn't going to simply disappear into obscurity. He's going to gather allies, study his enemies, and return as something far more dangerous than a rival. Prince. He's going to return as a warlord with nothing left to lose. Exile transforms Sundiata from a sheltered prince into a master of survival. For 7 years, he and his mother wander from kingdom to kingdom, each offering temporary refuge but none willing to risk Sumanguru's wrath by harboring them permanently. This isn't just physical hardship. It's a masterclass in diplomacy, strategy, and human psychology. In the kingdom of Wagadu, Sundiata learns the art of war from veteran generals still loyal to the old Ghana Empire. They teach him that battles are won in the mind before they're fought on the field. Victory belongs not to the strongest army, but to the leader who understands the deeper currents of fear, loyalty, and hope that drive human behavior. In Mema, he studies statecraft under King Musa, learning how to balance competing interests, manage resources, and build coalitions that survive beyond a single leader's lifetime. But most importantly, he learns to see patterns, how small actions ripple into large consequences, how today's mercy might become tomorrow's alliance, how temporary defeats can become strategic advantages. Meanwhile, back in Mali, Sumanguru's oppression has reached a breaking point. The Soso king has made a fatal error. He's confused fear with loyalty. His brutality has indeed crushed open resistance, but it's also created a network of underground resentment that spans the entire region. Village elders whisper about the days before his rule. Young warriors dream of liberation. Even his own allies begin to question whether a kingdom built on terror can truly endure. Into this powder keg of suppressed rage, a spark arrives in the form of desperate messengers. A delegation of Mali nobles, led by the great hunter Kamanjan, has traveled thousands of miles to find Sundiata. Their message is simple but earth-shaking. Come home. Your people are ready to fight. But Sundiata isn't the same broken boy who fled 7 years earlier. Exile has forged him into something new. A leader who understands that true power comes not from crushing your enemies, but from inspiring your allies to believe in something greater than themselves. His response reveals the strategic brilliance that will define his reign. I will return, but not as a prince seeking a throne. I will return as a liberator offering freedom. The difference is crucial. A prince fights for personal glory and inherited right. A liberator fights for everyone's future, and in 1235, that difference will prove decisive. Sundiata's return journey becomes a recruitment campaign of legendary proportions. At each stop, his story precedes him. The disabled prince who learned to walk, the exile who survived 7 years of hardship, the heir to prophecy who chooses to fight for his people rather than simply claim his birthright. But he doesn't just rely on charisma and legend. He demonstrates concrete value. When the kingdom of Du faces a drought, Sundiata negotiates trade agreements that bring relief. When bandits threaten trade routes through Keita, he personally leads hunting parties that restore security. When rival clans dispute territory boundaries, he proposes solutions that benefit everyone. Each success brings new allies. Each alliance reveals more about Sumanguru's weaknesses. Because here's what Sundiata discovers during his recruitment. Sumanguru's greatest strength is also his greatest vulnerability. The Soso king's supernatural reputation depends on maintaining an image of invincibility. He's never lost a major battle, never been publicly defied, never shown weakness. His entire psychological control system requires absolute dominance. But what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? The answer comes when Sundiata's growing coalition finally marches on Sumanguru's strongholds. The first confrontation isn't even military. It's a battle of symbols and stories. When Sundiata appears on the battlefield, walking tall with his iron staff gleaming in the sunlight, something shifts in the collective imagination of both armies. Sumanguru's soldiers see a figure from prophecy, a man who overcame impossible odds, a leader whose very existence challenges their master's claims of supernatural supremacy. Sundiata's warriors see their legends made flesh. The fulfillment of everything their grandparents promised would come to pass. The early battles are tactical masterpieces. Rather than attacking Sumanguru directly, Sundiata systematically dismantles his support network. He liberates tributary kingdoms one by one, offering generous terms to enemies who surrender and demonstrating spectacular military efficiency against those who resist. At Negaboria, he outflanks a Soso army twice his size using local guides who know hidden paths through the forest. At Tabon, he wins without fighting by convincing Sumanguru's allies that their king has abandoned them to face Sundiata alone. Each victory builds momentum while eroding his enemy's psychological advantage. But Sumanguru isn't finished. Desperate to restore his reputation, he challenges Sundiata to personal combat, a traditional trial by ordeal that will determine not just the battle's outcome, but the spiritual legitimacy of both leaders. This is the moment everything has been building toward. Not just the culmination of their personal conflict, but a clash between two completely different visions of leadership. Sumanguru represents power through fear, control through brutality, leadership as domination. Sundiata represents power through inspiration, control through loyalty, leadership as service. The fight itself becomes the stuff of legend. According to the griots, Sumanguru's supernatural powers protect him from conventional weapons. Arrows bounce off his skin, swords shatter against his body. For hours he seems invincible, just as his reputation claims. But then Sundiata remembers something his mother taught him, during those long nights when his legs wouldn't work. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from understanding your enemy's deepest fear. Sumanguru's secret isn't supernatural protection. It's psychological armor built on the belief that he's untouchable. His power depends on everyone, including himself, believing in his invincibility. But what if that belief could be shattered? Sundiata doesn't defeat Sumanguru with superior strength or magical weapons. He defeats him with a single, perfectly aimed arrow tipped with the spur of a white rooster, the one thing, according to ancient Soso beliefs, that can pierce supernatural defenses. The arrow strikes true. Sumanguru falls, and with him falls an entire system of oppression built on fear of the impossible. But victory in battle is just the beginning of Sundiata's real challenge. He now controls a vast territory filled with dozens of different ethnic groups, competing economic interests, and centuries-old tribal conflicts. How do you unite people who have been fighting each other for generations? How do you build something permanent from the temporary alliance that won a war? His answer will revolutionize the concept of governance itself. In 1236, 1 year after his victory over Sumanguru, Sundiata does something unprecedented in African history, something that wouldn't be attempted in Europe for another century. He calls together representatives from every corner of his new empire and asks them a simple question: how should we govern ourselves? The gathering at Gbara becomes the foundation of the Mali Constitution, the Mandan Charter, a document that establishes principles of justice, human rights, and democratic representation that seem impossibly progressive for the 13th century. Women's rights are protected. Environmental conservation is mandated. Social classes are defined by merit rather than birth. Most remarkably, the Charter includes provisions for limiting the emperor's own power. Think about that for a moment. Here's a man who just conquered an empire through military genius and personal charisma, and his first act is to voluntarily restrict his own authority. Why would someone who fought so hard for power immediately start giving it away? The answer reveals both Sundiata's greatest wisdom and his most tragic flaw. He understands that empires built on individual greatness die with their founders. If Mali is to outlast his lifetime, it needs systems that function regardless of who wears the crown. The Constitution isn't just governing document, it's his attempt to make himself replaceable. But there's a deeper motivation at work. Those 7 years of exile taught Sundiata what it feels like to be powerless, to depend on others' mercy, to watch injustice flourish while being unable to stop it. The Constitution is his insurance policy against ever creating another Sumanguru, even if that future tyrant turns out to be himself or his descendants. Under this new system, Mali explodes into prosperity. The gold mines of Bambouk and Bure operate at full capacity, but now their wealth flows through regulated channels that benefit entire communities rather than just elite rulers. Trade routes expand from the Atlantic coast to the Mediterranean shores, carrying not just gold and salt, but ideas, technologies, and cultural innovations that enrich everyone they touch. Timbuktu transforms from a minor trading post into an intellectual powerhouse rivaling Baghdad and Cairo. The University of Sankore attracts scholars from across the Islamic world, creating a center of learning that preserves and advances human knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, literature, and philosophy. Meanwhile, traditional African griots work alongside Islamic scribes, ensuring that both oral and written traditions survive for future generations. This is the Mali Empire at its peak, a civilization that successfully bridges African and Islamic cultures, traditional and modern governance, local autonomy, and imperial unity. European maps begin marking it as the richest kingdom in the world. Arab historians describe its cities as jewels of prosperity and learning. But success on this scale comes with prices that aren't immediately obvious. The first cost is personal. Sundiata has spent his entire adult life fighting, first for the right to walk, then for survival in exile, finally for military victory and political control. Now, suddenly, he must learn to lead in peacetime, to manage prosperity instead of struggle through hardship. It's a completely different set of skills, and ones his dramatic life hasn't prepared him for. The second cost is institutional. The Constitution he created works brilliantly for a founding generation that remembers why it was necessary. But what about their children, who grow up taking prosperity for granted? What about future leaders who never experience powerlessness and don't understand the temptation to abuse authority? The third cost is strategic. Mali's wealth makes it a target for every ambitious neighboring kingdom and distant power. Success breeds envy, and envy breeds conflict. The same trade networks that bring prosperity also create vulnerabilities. Routes that can be disrupted, partners who might become competitors, resources that others covet. But the deepest cost is psychological. Sundiata has achieved everything the prophecy promised and more. He's built an empire, established justice, brought prosperity to millions. But what does a man do when he's accomplished the impossible? What motivates someone who has already exceeded his wildest dreams? The griots tell us that in his final years, Sundiata became increasingly isolated, spending long hours alone, wrestling with questions that have no clear answers. He had succeeded beyond all measure, but success itself had become a burden. Every decision carried the weight of millions of lives. Every policy affected generations yet unborn. The boy, who fought simply to walk, had become responsible for an entire civilization's future. In 1255, Sundiata dies not in battle or from assassination, but from the quiet exhaustion of absolute responsibility. His last words, according to the oral traditions, are both triumphant and melancholy. "I have planted seeds that will outlive the forest." But who can say what manner of trees they will grow into? The question proves prophetic. Mali continues to flourish for centuries after Sundiata's death, becoming even wealthier and more influential under later rulers. But it also faces challenges he couldn't foresee: internal succession disputes, external invasions, economic disruptions, and the gradual erosion of the democratic principles he worked so hard to establish. His great-great-nephew Mansa Musa becomes perhaps the richest individual in human history, but rules with an autocratic style that abandons many of Sundiata's constitutional innovations. The empire's wealth reaches legendary proportions, but its political structure becomes increasingly centralized and vulnerable. The irony is devastating. Sundiata succeeded in creating a system that outlasted him, but he couldn't ensure that future generations would preserve the values that made that system worth preserving. So, what's Sundiata's true legacy? Is he the African Alexander, the medieval democrat, the founding father of constitutional government? Or is he a cautionary tale about the impossibility of building permanent institutions in a world driven by human ambition and circumstance? The answer, like most historical truths, is complicated. On one hand, Sundiata's achievements are undeniable. He created the largest empire in medieval African history, established principles of governance that were centuries ahead of their time, and built a civilization that bridged cultures and continents in ways that still influence West African society today. The Mandinka people trace their democratic traditions directly back to his constitution. Modern Mali's national symbols and cultural identity still draw heavily on his story. But on the other hand, his empire's ultimate fate reveals the limitations of individual greatness. Mali eventually fragmented, its wealth dispersed, its democratic innovations forgotten by later rulers who preferred the simplicity of absolute power. The very success that made it legendary also made it a target for forces, both internal and external, that Sundiata couldn't anticipate or control. Perhaps that's the most human thing about this legendary figure. He solved the problems of his own time brilliantly, but he couldn't solve the problems of all time. He created something magnificent, but he couldn't make it permanent. He changed the world, but he couldn't change human nature. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the measure of a life isn't whether your achievements last forever, but whether they demonstrate what's possible when someone refuses to accept that limitations are permanent. Sundiata's story isn't just about building an empire, it's about transforming disability into strength, exile into education, and personal triumph into collective liberation. Today, when we face our own impossible challenges, social inequalities that seem insurmountable, political systems that seem broken beyond repair, global problems that seem too complex for any individual to address, Sundiata's example offers something more valuable than easy answers. It offers proof that transformation is possible, that the boy who couldn't walk can become the man who builds empires, that the outcast can become the liberator, that someone with nothing can create something that changes everything. The griots who preserve his story across centuries understand this. They don't just tell us what Sundiata accomplished. They remind us what any of us might accomplish if we're willing to bend iron with our bare hands, to turn exile into education, to transform our greatest weaknesses into our most powerful strengths. So here's the question his story leaves us with. What iron staff are you waiting to grip? What impossible thing are you ready to attempt? What empire, whether personal, professional, or political, are you prepared to build from the ashes of your own limitations? Because if history teaches us anything, it's that the most extraordinary achievements often come from the most ordinary people who simply refuse to stay down when life knocks them flat. The Lion King of Mali started as a boy who couldn't walk. He ended as a man who taught a continent to stand. What's your excuse for staying on the ground? If you found Sundiata's incredible journey from disability to empire as fascinating as we did, you're going to love our upcoming documentary on Mansa Musa, the man who inherited Sundiata's kingdom and became so wealthy that his generosity literally crashed entire economies. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss that mind-blowing story, and let us know in the comments, which part of Sundiata's transformation impressed you most? His physical triumph over disability, his political genius in creating Africa's first constitution, or his military strategy that defeated seemingly supernatural enemies. And here's a challenge for history lovers. Can you think of any other historical figures who overcame similar physical limitations to achieve greatness? Share their stories below. We might feature them in future episodes.